All right, so Minnesota finally made some moves as we kind of expected them to. One of them certainly was expected in the cutting of Xavier Rhodes. The other one, I was unsure if they would actually do it, but it kind of makes some sense to do, and I have gone over this briefly on the channel before. Um, but he did miss 2 games, or probably would have been 3 if it weren't for a bye. And I go through why they did this. So without him, they played Dallas and Denver, right? So in against Dallas, they had 22 attempts on the ground for 50 yards, only averaged 2.3 yards a carry. Their long was 7 and didn't allow a score. And against Denver, there was 33 total attempts for 124 yards, but only 3.8 yards per carry, and a long of 11. They did end up scoring a touchdown on the ground, and at least in those 55 attempts that we have without him, it was only 174 yards, which was only good for 3.2 yards per carry. The longest run they allowed was 11, of course. They did allow 1 score, and then their yards per game was only 87 in that 2-game span. So, but with Linval Joseph, obviously this is a much, much bigger sample size, which was, 315 total attempts for 1,396 yards, then a long of 91 with 6 touchdowns allowed. And that's 107.4 yards per game and 4.4 yards per carry. And a lot of people I know are already going like, well, the sample size is so ridiculously skewed, which is true. But they did only play 2 top 5 rushing teams this entire season, being number 4 and number 5 in Seattle and the Dallas Cowboys. We already went over Dallas, and that was without Linval Joseph. We had Linval Joseph for Seattle, which was 43 attempts for 218 yards, 5.1 yards per carry, a long of 29, and 2 scores on the ground, which is ridiculous. Like, you can't be allowing that. Like, I know Seattle was 1 above them in terms of being 4th, and Dallas was 5, but that's only a 3 yards per carry more difference in the averages. But the difference in playing them for Minnesota, at least, was 168 yards. And between things like that going on with him being, turning 32, and he carried a $12.8 million cap hit, I can't really say I'm too shocked by this, because they save $10.4 million by cutting him, which is ridiculous. And I do think it is a possibility for him to kind of come back and, well, at a very much reduced price. But even if that doesn't happen, you have veteran options out there. You have guys like Damon Harrison, and Ndamukong Suh is out there potentially. You have Danny Shelton. Dontari Poe isn't expected to get his option picked up. And you have DJ Reader as well. And that's all the ones I could think of, like, off the top of my head. But at least as veteran options, you do have things to replace him potentially if he doesn't want to come back at, anything less than that $12.8 million, which I don't think he's getting from anybody. But the cutting of him and Rhodes puts Minnesota from $1.3 million, like a little bit over that, to a shade under $20 million at $19.97. And going into, Rhodes now, the much more expected version of this. So in 2019, Xavier Rhodes, he was targeted 81 times, allowed 66 of those to be caught. That's an 81.5%. He had 6 pass deflections, 12 yards per yards a completion on him, and 9.8 yards a target. He allowed 4 scores and a quarterback rating of 123.8. And all these numbers are coming from Pro Football Reference, except for this one, which is because I know some people like the Pro Football Focus grades, which was, for him, an abysmal 46.4. And we all knew this one was going to happen. Rhodes declined drastically and quite rapidly. So, and he was accounting for $12.9 million against the cap. Cutting him saves $8.1 million in cap. His dead cap is 4.8, but, since it happened in this month and not last month in, March, they can designate this as a post-June 1st cut, and what that does is that cuts that in half for, the next 2 seasons here. So instead of eating all of that 4.8 this year, you eat 2.4 this year and 2.4 next year, which I imagine what's probably going to happen. And the only real issue that comes from this is the fact that Trey Waynes and Mackenzie Alexander are also free agents. And just to say what they did, Waynes also struggled. I think that was mostly kind of glistened over just because of how bad Rhodes was playing, and a lot of people were like, well, Rhodes is so bad, we can't talk about anything else in the secondary, which almost was true. But Trey Waynes was targeted a crazy amount of times, at 96. He allowed 71 completions, that's 74%, 10.1 yards per completion, 7.5 yards per target. He had 8 pass deflections. Quarterback rating of 107.9 against him. He allowed 5 scores, and his PFF grade was 65.1. And a lot of his deal was he was actually just losing a lot of those one-on-one matchups that otherwise he would be deflecting or able to cause, usually contested to where the other player couldn't catch it. And he was losing a lot of those. Just, do you say this is one bad season, or is this what he is now? Gonna have to decide. And then you have Mackenzie Alexander, also a free agent, was only targeted 58 times, which is actually a much more normal amount, but, in this case it's an only because of 81 and 96. He allowed 38 completions on those 58 targets, 65.5%, which is actually a solid percentage. 8.5 yards per completion, 5.6 yards per target, 5 pass deflections. He allowed 2 scores, had a quarterback rating of 84.3 against him, and a PFF grade of 65.7. So, much better for Mackenzie Alexander in the nickel. So, what this does to Minnesota is they have a choice with Mike Hughes now. Is he an outside or is he a nickel? And personally, I think we should put him on the outside. I think he's much more comfortable there. I feel like you keep a solid nickel in Alexander, and you just throw him where he's actually comfortable, because that makes sense to me, especially since if you watch Minnesota's defense, the nickel is really weird, because a lot of what they do is they cause a lot of bracket coverages in with Barr and Kendricks into the middle. So they actually protect that outside more than their inside, which is kind of like a cardinal sin of nickels. And, well, that's kind of going against most of the nickel things, because, it's pretty hard to train that into a nickel once they have been doing it one way their whole life, and now they have to do it this way. And we've trained one in Alexander, so I think we should keep him, especially since nickels tend to be cheaper than outside corners anyway. So even though Alexander played better last season, I expect Alexander to get significantly less than Trey Waynes. So, and what this would end up doing is giving Minnesota 2 young corners on the outside, because Holton Hill, remember him, because both will be in their age 23 seasons next season, and they both have potential. And that doesn't mean they would be set at corner. I just don't think it. I think that setup would make it at least not a first round need, probably into the second, third round kind of category. Like, it's simply something they need to address, but it's not so glaring to where it's like, well, if we have to choose between the tackle and the corner, like, it doesn't really pigeonhole themselves into that. And people do need to remember, because I feel like I'm going to get thrown at this a lot, Holton Hill. He was viewed as a day 2 prospect by a lot of people coming into that draft, and why he went undrafted was because of marijuana, which in this new CBA looks like they're essentially trying to no longer suspend players for marijuana. So I feel like a lot of the risk in him is now out, and you can just trust him to be there. And there you have it. You might have your physical corner replacement for Rhodes right on the roster at a, much better athletic profile, at least in their careers now as it stands. And I would like to know your comments on all this stuff below. Liking, subscribing always helps. And until next time, I bid y'all adieu.